The night before the concert, Whitney Houston couldn't get warm. She was sitting in her hotel room on the 14th floor of the Ritz-Carlton, wrapped in a hotel robe that probably cost more than her first apartment in Newark, and she still couldn't get warm. Outside, November rain was doing what November rain does in New York, turning everything gray and mean. Inside, the room was perfectly heated. She just couldn't feel it. She had a show tomorrow night. Carnegie Hall, national broadcast on PBS. 40 million people watching, give or take. She had performed for bigger crowds for stages in Tokyo and London and Sao Paulo for 60,000 people at once. She knew what it felt like to own a room, but Charles Whitmore had a way of making you feel like you didn't own anything. The project had started 8 months earlier, in the spring of 1993. The Bodyguard soundtrack was still everywhere. I Will Always Love You had spent 14 weeks at #1. Whitney was the biggest selling female artist on the planet, and everybody knew it, which was exactly why the phone call from the American Voices production team felt so strange. American Voices was a PBS concert series that had been running for 12 years. It wasn't designed for pop stars. It was designed for a very specific kind of American music. Orchestral standards, classical arrangements, the kind of material that requires you to have something to say before you think about how to say it. Sarah Vaughan had been on this show. Ella Fitzgerald, Leontine Price. Whitney Houston was not the obvious next name on that list. The person who made it happen was her mother, Cissy Houston, which was appropriate because most things in Whitney's musical life eventually trace back to Cissy. She had connections to the production team going back years, and she had made a phone call. A quiet one, not a favor. More like a suggestion that somebody ought to pay attention. The artistic director of American Voices was Charles Whitmore, 71 years old, 4 decades conducting orchestras from Philadelphia to Berlin, 2 Pulitzer Prizes, a reputation so serious that younger conductors reportedly got nervous riding in the same elevator with him. He had opinions about music the way some people have opinions about religion, because it was the only truth he'd ever known. When someone told him Whitney Houston was being considered, he was quiet for a long moment. "She's very talented," he said finally. The way he said it made clear that very talented wasn't the same thing as right for this. The first meeting happened in April, in a rehearsal space in Midtown Manhattan. Whitney had prepared. She always prepared, even when people assumed she didn't. She had listened to every American Voices broadcast she could find. She had pulled out old records, Vaughan, Fitzgerald, Dinah Washington, and sat with them the way you sit with something you're trying to understand, not just hear. She had talked to her mother about what Whitmore's world required, about the distance between a stadium and a concert hall. She walked in ready. Whitmore was already at the piano, a tall man who had gone thin with age, white hair, very pale eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He introduced himself without standing up, which was either a professional habit or a statement. Probably both. "I'd like to hear you sing something," he said, without amplification. She had sung without a microphone before, but there was something about the way he said it that felt like he was stripping away every layer of technology just to see what was actually underneath. She stood in the center of the room and sang 16 bars from the arrangement, a classic American standard, reimagined with a full orchestral score. Complex chord changes, unusual phrasing, the kind of song where the words and the music argue with each other in ways that take real craft to resolve. When she finished, Whitmore was quiet. Then, the top of the second phrase, "You're carrying your pop instinct into it. The note needs to land differently." She waited for more. There wasn't more. He had already looked back down at his score. She drove home replaying the phrase in her head the entire way. If you've ever loved a voice that changed your life, subscribe and stay with us. This story is just getting started. Her mother had a friend in New Jersey named Patricia Monroe, who had spent 30 years as a vocal coach for classical and jazz performers. Retired technically, but she still kept a studio in her house. A small room with an upright piano and better acoustics than most professional spaces Whitney had worked in. The first thing Monroe told her that morning was, "Your voice is a gift. Your habits are not." She said it without cruelty. Just the truth, stated cleanly, the way someone states a fact about the weather. What Monroe meant was that Whitney had spent her entire career using her instrument in a specific way, forward, projecting, propelling energy outward toward an audience of thousands. Exactly right for what she normally did. Exactly wrong for what she was about to do. "You push," Monroe said. "This music doesn't want to be pushed. It wants to be inhabited." They worked every morning for 6 weeks, 7 a.m. in that little room, no audience, no engineers, no one keeping track of anything except whether the note was right. Monroe made her slow down until slowing down felt natural, made her hold notes she normally released, made her sit inside the breath instead of riding ahead of it. Some mornings it was humiliating. She had been singing professionally since she was a teenager, had sold 100 million records. And here she was, in a retired woman's spare room, learning things nobody in her industry had ever needed her to know. The pop world asked for something else entirely. Monroe's room didn't care about any of that. "Again," Monroe would say, the same way Whitmore had said it, and Whitney would begin again. She went back to Whitmore in May. The second session was different, not warmer. Whitmore didn't do warm, but more precise. The corrections were smaller now. He spent 20 minutes on a single passage, adjusting how she approached one interval. When she finally landed it the way he heard it in his head, he was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "just that." But as Whitmore nodded at his score that evening, nobody in that room could have guessed how close Whitney had come to walking away entirely. By August, something had shifted that was hard to name, but easy to feel. Gospel had taught her to fill, to pour herself into the song, to let the spirit overflow. But Whitmore's music asked for something different. It asked her to know when not to fill, to find the place where presence meant holding rather than releasing, where the silence wasn't empty but loaded. She had grown up in a church. She understood the difference between a shout and a prayer. The third session with Whitmore lasted 3 hours. He took her through the full arrangement twice. At the end, he closed his score and looked at her across the room. "You've been working," he said. From Charles Whitmore, that sentence landed like a standing ovation. November 15th, 1993. Carnegie Hall. The green room backstage smelled like old wood and rosin and decades of performance. Whitney sat in the chair closest to the mirror, not really looking at herself. The orchestra was tuning in the hall, that familiar chaos of 100 instruments finding the same pitch from different starting points. She thought about that phrase Whitmore had flagged the very first day, how she'd been landing it wrong and hadn't known. How many mornings in Monroe's little room she had gotten it wrong, then a little less wrong, then finally right. She thought about Whitmore's eyes during that first session, the careful, measured look that wasn't contempt, just professional uncertainty. "I'm giving you a chance," those eyes had said. "Don't make me regret it." She had thought about that look for 8 months. The stage manager appeared in the doorway. "2 minutes, Miss Houston." She walked toward the stage. What 40 million people saw that night was Whitney Houston walk onto the Carnegie Hall stage in a black gown, looking like someone who had always belonged there, completely without apology. What they couldn't see was Whitmore standing in the wings. The orchestra settled. The room went quiet the way only Carnegie Hall goes quiet, completely suddenly, like a door closing. The conductor raised his baton. The opening notes rose from the strings, slow and formal and achingly beautiful. And then Whitney opened her mouth. The first note was not big. That was the thing nobody expected. She came in underneath the orchestra, inside it, finding a line through the music rather than standing on top of it. She let the song carry her for a moment before she began to carry it. And by the second phrase, something had changed in the room. People had stopped breathing. There is a specific quality to an audience that has been surprised by something real. It's not excitement, it's closer to stillness, a collective leaning in that happens without anyone deciding to lean. That quality was in Carnegie Hall from the moment Whitney found her footing. People watching something they hadn't expected. Not a pop star performing classical material. Something more complicated than that. They were watching someone who had done the work. They were watching someone who had done the work. She moved through the arrangement the way Whitmore had asked, inhabiting each phrase, sitting inside the notes, letting the silence do what it was supposed to do. And then she reached the passage that had given her the most trouble, the one Monroe had made her repeat until her patience was thin, the one that required everything she had learned in those 6 weeks in New Jersey and 3 sessions in Midtown. She landed it perfectly. The room stayed silent for 1 full second after the last note faded. A Carnegie Hall second, which is its own unit of time. Then the audience broke open. In the wings, Charles Whitmore did not applaud. He stood and watched, quiet the way he was always quiet. Then he said something to himself, to the darkness backstage, that a stagehand nearby would later repeat to a journalist, who printed it without embellishment because it didn't need any. "I was wrong about her," Whitmore said, 3 words. From that man, in that moment, worth more than most sentences ever written about music. Whitney knew what the night had been about before anyone told her. You know something like that in your body, in the way your exhale feels different when it's over. This was never really about Charles Whitmore. It was about the girl from Newark, Sissy Houston's daughter, the one who grew up singing gospel in the New Hope Baptist Church and understood from childhood that singing wasn't performance. It was testimony. She had testified tonight. And somewhere in the building, a 71-year-old man with 2 Pulitzer Prizes stood in the dark and quietly changed his mind. That doesn't happen often, not to men like him. But Whitney had walked in, and the verdict wasn't written yet. She sat down. She worked. She came back. And by the end of it, she had earned something nobody could take back. Not a critic, not a decade of dismissal, not a room full of people who had decided what she was before she walked through the door. The song was the song, and the note was the note, and you either sang it or you didn't. She sang it, and for the first time in a long time, the room had nothing left to say. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on you, only to silence every last doubt with the one thing nobody could take away? Tell us your story in the comments below.